hadn't been for Tam and Lisa writing their sections first, I wouldn't have known how to do it. If somebody had said, write about your father's life from birth to death, I would have said, you're kidding, that'll be 2 pages, if that, because I don't have it. But see, when you start looking at birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, MI5 files, and all kinds of other material, you realise it's possible to do an A to Z, a whole life of the person, even if it's not the length of a book. We wanted to show how they came from different backgrounds with very different histories, but they had in common a fierce commitment to a cause that led to them spending a life-changing period together in Spain 86 years ago. Our fathers fought Franco. And I'll hand you over now to Jennie Renton.
I'm going to stand up. I said that at the very first. We've done 6 of these events. And at the first one I said, I'm going to stand up because I'm small. I want you to see me. I want to see all of you. But most of all, because my dad stood up for what all these events we've done. The one that's making me feel most nervous is this one, because it's Portobello, where my dad was born, in Bridge Street. It's Mount Lodge Place, where my granny lived. A man came into my bookshop and said one day, I've got to see you because I was brought up in Mount Lodge Place. And he remembered being 7 years old, and he was about 85, and he was saying, I was 7 years old, and I was woken up by this man coming down the street singing the Internationale, and his mum was going, that's just Donald Renton, get back to bed. And there's all of that. But it's really moving for me to be here also because many members of my family who have kept away from everything else are here. And I'd say in particular my cousin Pat, because her dad, Bill Cranston, he went out to fight in Spain just at the point when our fathers were being exchanged, an exchange of prisoners, which they were very lucky after spending 3 months in prison, having been captured on the very first night they were in battle, the Battle of Jarama. And my Uncle Bill had a good reason for not being captured or wounded. Well, he said he was so small, he was just not a very good target. So that was his thing. But he was there for 18 months actually. And he recalls, I've written a wee note of what he said. And yeah, his way of, he was never a communist actually. His way of dealing with things was, as he put it, I used my own discretion. And he looked around him, and like my father, who looked around him and saw poverty, and saw the rise of fascism, and both of them were involved in fighting fascism on the streets. And in fact, my Uncle Bill never committed as a communist, but he committed as a human being who wanted to sort of do anything that he could to stop the rise of fascism in Europe, which I have to say is something that we are seeing now. We're seeing the rise of fascism across Europe, and it really is each of our obligations as a human being and a member of society to just see what we can do to envision and act out different ways of being, because it may
I'll tell you a wee story about my father. My father was born into a mining family. When he was 2 years old, his 14-year-old cousin was killed in a mining accident. When he was 14, his older brother was killed in another mining accident. And I think that's one of the things that made him militant. He, if you're working in these, he worked in the mines himself, and if you're working in these conditions and you're getting barely enough to live on, and then you're told by the government, as happened in 1926, at the time of the general strike, and you're told by the government, you're getting your hours increased, and there's an extra bonus, your wages are getting cut. I'm not surprised it was militant. And I would like to think I would be militant as well in that situation. As a result of the fact that he was so militant during the miners' strike, or during the general strike it was called, he was blacklisted from the industry. And it was pretty well known the work that there was in Prestonpans. There was 5 or 6 mines round about there at that time. Wrote down here the fact that he was a communist. He was a good friend of Jennie's dad, and they took part in the hunger marches. Both of them went to the Mosley meeting at the Usher Hall. Jennie's dad stood up and sung the International. And my father was sitting at the front of the hall, and he stood up and was interrupting Mosley. And Mosley complained. He said, you're denying me freedom of speech. My father asked him, he says, look, in the countries, he said, you're the British Union of fascism, in the countries that are your friends, he says, do they have freedom of speech there? And of course Mosley didn't answer that, other than getting them chucked out and beat up, as indeed Jennie's dad was beaten up as well.
How did you get the MI5 records?
It's not easy. I'm involved with the International Brigade Memorial Trust, which is an organisation based at the Marks Memorial Library in London. And they're very helpful. They've got really fabulous archivists who will help with information if you need it, documentation. But it was another guy from Portsmouth, because he was born in Portsmouth, my grandfather. This guy, Alan Lloyd, he was looking at all the Portsmouth men, and he found my name, and he managed to get to, through Kew Gardens, I can't remember what it's called now. It's when the Freedom of Information Act came, that they were allowed to get these, but it wasn't easy.
There's a historian called Richard Baxel who's got a great website. He was the person who contacted me and said, I've looked at your father's MI5 material, you can get it, and he sent that to me. But on the MI5, I'm saying the MI5 site, on the Kew Gardens site, it was a fascinating little article about a lovely woman who was a secretary to Harry Pollitt in the 1930s, and she was working for MI5. And it's got a lovely little praiseworthy at it, because nobody knew and nobody suspected. So they were, I would say they were everywhere, and they were into anything that was going on with the Communist Party in the 1930s. So what of my father, I got something that was bare bones, index cards, but it had facts in it. And even those minimal facts, when he joined the Communist Party, my father used to say I joined the Communist Party on 16th of February 1932. That's true, he did. Then it gave some other little details of when he went to Spain and the part of the details. So those are small things, but you cling on to them when you don't have a lot of other material. So but there is obviously a backstory there, which is the British destroy a lot of records, hide a lot of records. So there's always a limited amount of material you can get hold of.
Yeah. What I was going to say is I'm quite sure the stuff that's in Willy's dad's MI5 file would have been like what was in my father's. Not a single thing illegal for spying on them, and he wasn't accused of doing anything that was illegal.
But the Communist Party was seen as a threat. That was the problem.
Another thing I personally found through researching for the book, well, found it unfortunately just after the book was published. I found out my father finished up in court after the ruckus that was in Usher Hall, and in the paper it said that the judge refused to accept statements that had been taken up at the High Street, where they were all taken up to by the police. And I didn't know why that was relevant, and why my father, who was defending himself, had asked for these statements to be read out. And it turned out the fascist, who was the witness against him, my father was in the front row at Usher Hall. That same fascist had said, because the vast majority of the anti-fascists, you needed a ticket to get in the front. And my father had got one through the Edinburgh University students, that this fascist had presumed it was up in the balcony where most of the anti-fascists were. And he gave a statement to that effect. And what my father pointed out was he couldn't stand up in court, which he did, and say, yeah, I seen him at the front of the hall, he was sitting there, and so on. And then have it read out that he had previously said he had identified him as being in the balcony. So it showed you where the courts were on the side.
But, there's a group of trade unionists from Liverpool who they do a trip out to look at the men from the North West, is where I'm from. So I joined them, and Mum came. Mum went. We went. It was the anniversary on the 75th anniversary, and we went to Madrid, and we were told don't wear anything with the Republican flag on, because there's so much well, a lot of, you know, in Madrid and Spain, apart from perhaps Barcelona, but it's very divided. But don't wear a badge, don't wear a flag, until you get out. When you get to Jarama, you can. So they took us to south of Madrid, is where the Battle of Jarama was, and we went there. They took us on a tour, and we went, and this guy said, I said, can you tell me where they were captured? And he found the exact spot. So me and Mum were there, and Mum smelled this smell of thyme, and that's when you were quite emotional then, weren't you? And and she said that's why he wouldn't allow thyme in the garden, because thyme, he was a big gardener.
Whatever was happening that year, so he wasn't a nostalgist. Not that, I mean, I know history is important, and he did talk a lot about that, and he valued it. But he did go back in 1996. My brother went with him. My father went to Jarama. I don't think he'd been out of the country since the Second World War, my father, but he went to Spain then, and there was a group of them that were taking around Jarama with my brother. So I wasn't there, and I didn't follow him. So I haven't been in those footsteps, but I would like to go. So maybe next year I'll go over there and look at the Jarama Valley, because that's something I'd like to see and haven't seen.
There's a chance that we can get our Spanish nationality
through the
if we want. Yeah, so
we might go there as Spanish citizens.
Yeah.
I just got my Irish citizenship, so I
think you don't get the news in the same way, so were they aware of what's happening? What was that?
My father read the Daily Watcher as it was, and they were giving plenty of coverage to what the fascists were doing. If you've seen the newsreels, as Wally was saying earlier, we found several newsreels and things like that, and there's a distinct bias towards the fascists, I would say, in the newsreels. The men were starving, and yet they're showing they're handed bowls of soup and loaves of bread when the cameras are there, and the narrator says this is them being fed, and the food they're being fed, there's plenty of food, there's no shortage of food for them, and it was all lies. They even handed them a packet of cigarettes each when the cameras were rolling, and as soon as they finished recording the newsreel, the cigarettes were taken off them.
I think it's an interesting question about literature. There was no social media, but people were reading. My father was 10 years old when the First World War ended, and he said the men came back, and every street corner was a crowd of men talking about what had happened in France, Germany, all over Europe. That was the talk, non-stop, every day, men talking in the corner, unemployment, talking politics all the time, talking about what was happening in China, all the so-called threat of the yellow peril that was coming up at the time. And my father remembers all that, and so people were constantly talking politics in the street everywhere. My father ended up with a soapbox that he carried from Govan Cross to Glasgow Green, talking. Tram drivers would took their horns because they knew him. So people were constantly talking, and what they were talking was politics. That was the politics, was their daily bread. They spoke it all the time. They had the Daily Worker, but they had other sources of literature, pamphlets and stuff like that. When John McGovern, the MP for Shettleston, I think, gave I'm getting this right, but he gave a speech at the City Halls in 1936, November 36, called Why the Bishops Backed Franco. 1,000 or 1,200 people turned up, And very shortly after that, a wee pamphlet appeared with the speech in it. I've got a copy of it. So so there was a literature there that people reading, and there was constant political chatter. Nobody was talking about Britain's Got Talent. The one they were talking about Scotland's Got Communism.
Well, there was a massive aid movement as well throughout the country, and in the poorest places they collected the most money, really, and they sent off ambulances, and they sent you know, fully equipped ambulances with medical aid, sent nurses out there, all through volunteers. I mean, I did some research in Wigan, and the unemployment there in that mining town at the time was really, really high. But they managed to, they were wheeling around the prams around the street, collecting money, collecting milk, collecting food to send to Spain, even though they were really, really desperate themselves. No welfare state then, you know.
Yeah, what happened in Spain happens too often on the left, which is that the groups out there to fight fascism ended up fighting each other. I wonder if you...
The civil war
any
within the
thoughts on
civil
that?
war.
Yeah, even to start off by saying...
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm deaf, so you have to...
So I will shout, so even to say civil war would start a fight in an empty room. Because for other people it was a revolution. And for Paul Preston, who's the great historian of the Spanish Civil War, it was a colonial war that came out of Africa because Spain lost face and colonies in Morocco and in North Africa. So he sees it as a colonial war. It was a displacement of colonialism onto the proletariat. Spain became the enemy for Franco.
Yeah.
And he's got loads of... Paul Preston is very good on that. So was it a colonial war? But the backdraft of a colonial war? Was it a civil war? And let's face it, civil wars in the United States, in Nigeria, in Ireland, in England in the 17th century, civil wars are deeply divisive. People in the same family, Michael Portillo's family on different sides, that happens. The left always fight, and there was anarchists there, socialists, communists. They took a different view on what the war was about.
Well, not just a different view, there was lots of fighting between the groups,
well, there was
between the POUM and with the Trotskyists,
yeah.
the Stalinists,
and POUM, remember, they were Marxist
and
party.
on.
People take that out because they think there's communists, and then there was something nice called POUM that Orwell was with. So the whole, I think the fact is the history is still being written, and we know that because we're finding new photographs and new information. In Spain, it's the grandchildren that have said, we're fed up with the silence, and we want to know where our fathers are buried, and we want the truth. So I think now in Spain, because they lived with Franco, unlike Mussolini, unlike Hitler, Franco stayed in. Now I'll give you a clue, Gibraltar.
Well, it was a proxy war for the Nazis as well.
It was a proxy war because the Luftwaffe were bombing in Guernica, but also the German tanks, look it up, German tanks were in Spain being tested. They were testing the German tanks in Spain. It was a prelude and rehearsal for the war. Mussolini went, Hitler went, Franco stayed in power for 40 years. They had a huge charm offensive in Britain and the USA because they were the only two countries that mattered for Spain, Britain and the USA, to get them on side. But Gibraltar had to be held, and a deal was made that Franco would allow Gibraltar to remain British and to be used, provided there was a hands-off attitude. There was a big love-in the House of Commons. They got all the Catholic MPs and so on the right to say Franco remaining in power is a way of keeping communism out, and you have to understand that one of Hitler's main moves and what lost the war for him was Operation Barbarossa in 1941 against the Soviet Union. It was suicide, but it was suicide that had to be committed because he hated communism. Franco hated communism. Churchill hated communism, and in the end, communism was heftily defeated despite Churchill standing up in August 1944 and saying the Russians tore the guts out of Hitler's war machine. So the Russians tore the guts out of Hitler's war machine. Franco stayed in power for 40 years, and you can work that out.
Jenny.
Right, well, I just wanted to say a few things about that. I wanted to say a few things to what you said.
Sorry, say again.
You're talking about all the schisms that happen on the left. You're talking about the divisions on the left.
I'm talking about
yes.
the conflict between the Trotskyists, the Stalinists, the anarchists.
Yeah, well, these things happen.
All the right want to do is win. They'll do anything to win.
No, I think one of the problems involved, this is my perspective and would not be my dad's perspective, is when people become super ideological. It becomes like a sort of theology. People look at their texts and they behave as if this is what is correct. Yeah. You know, this is what is wrong. So that's one element of it. Another element is what we were talking about before, and it shouldn't be underestimated. the degree of influence that infiltration by agents provocateurs on left-wing groups has had. Their job has been to be the people who are there and very useful and helpful, and to destroy these movements by this sort of thing, by fomenting schisms like that. But when you talk about, I remember it was one Christmas, I don't know, it must have been about 20 or something, and I was with my dad and my boyfriend at the time, and we were just going through the tunnel at Niddry, at Bingham. My dad's been saying, the people on the march, the roads are treading, the roads to freedom. And then I said something, I used the word George Orwell. And he just like, Jennifer, we were fighting a war. There was no time for farms and that nonsense, you see. And it was just like, you know, right there, you know. And so the feelings in Spain, I mean, there were huge numbers of different factions, but the fact was, these factions, and there were divisions and there was infighting, but they all saw that fascism was a big enemy. And that's what took them there. I'm afraid we can't do anything about the way things tend to happen.
Orwell never fired a gun at a fascist. He was fighting against the supporters of the Spanish government. And he's got a lot of fans, people on the left. And how they admire him, I don't know, because he was fighting alongside the POOM who were trying to overthrow the democratic elected government. And the other thing is, all this talk about it was communism or fascism, there wasn't a single MP in the Spanish government that was a member of the Communist Party. So it's a handy excuse for them.
Good. There's another question just over here. Yep.
You've talked about the Pathé News and all these newsreels that you've discovered. When could we see that, or where can
I'll tell you, there's a brilliant one that just came to light very recently, and it's Hearst Metrotone in New York, but they've got the film is held at
far to go?
No, you don't. I'm going to come to
Online.
University of California at Los Angeles have got the most beautifully digitised Peter Jackson, Eat Your Heart Out, Get Back, Get Back. This 4 minutes of the most beautiful footage you've ever seen, which is basically the newsreel footage, but in a kind of raw form with, you see them getting off the lorry twice, and they've obviously rehearsed things and repeated little things and all that. The names of the guilty, because we got to show it at the Edinburgh Festival, but we had to say it was not for commercial purposes. But do you know something? I think that if somebody's hiding footage of your father, or not letting you get hold of it, I tried to get hold of the RTE footage, and they said you can't get it, and I thought, you've got a piece of footage in a film from 1976, which you've got a voiceover of Frank Ryan, which has got nothing to do with that footage, and that's my father.
Yeah.
And the man to see it, luckily I had a friend in Tipperary who pulled it out of the film and sent me it. So really we have to kind of break down the barriers. I believe in open access. A lot of stuff is hidden. It's bad enough that the Spanish Civil War isn't sufficiently well known without people hiding and hoarding materials.
But things are coming out all the time. We are managing. I know that there's when the Brigades returned from Spain, not our guys, but when they were pulled out, they were sent home. There's a film, Pathé News, of that, and that's just been released. And what they've done is they've got it's silent, but they've got a lip reader who's interpreted it. So we're hoping to do that because Tam's father is saying something. What's he saying to that guard? We're dying to know what he's saying.
It only lasts about 14 seconds. But a couple of the other men that stand behind them are laughing at what they would have said. So I think it's something sarcastic.
Yeah, something I'm not going to get involved.
Have we got time for another? What's the story with the Have we got time for another question?
Mine is very quick. It's just to know whether you might go to Spain and do this in Spain, especially.
I'd love to do it. I didn't have a lot of ambitions for the book beforehand except to tell the stories, but I've got 3 wishes now. Translation into Spanish, long listed for some kind of award because I think it deserves it. That might be fishing a bit. And then to get it adapted for stage, for film, for television, maybe as a documentary, who knows? Because I think it would make a fantastic story, The 4 Lives of the Woven.
Well, that's it, because these are, I mean, a lot of, like you say about Orwell, or, I mean, other people who've done films, but a lot of it's through, like, those people who, the educated people, the more
middle
intellectuals,
class
the middle class and that, these are ordinary fellas, and they were the majority who went to Spain.
Yeah.
They need more representing and more people to understand that it was a working class sort of struggle, really.
But you've got to be fair to Orwell for a second. At the end of Homage to Catalonia, Orwell says, I'm saying nothing against the ordinary communists who held the line at Madrid and fought heroically. Unfortunately, Orwell's inheritors don't read Orwell and don't understand that Orwell was not saying anything against the ordinary communists who are now all tarnished as Stalinists and fools and deluded,
But
like
he
the
was
Daily
saying
Mail.
something against my dad because he was a political commissar.
Yes, true.
And you don't mention his name in Wigan either. You don't like him.
I'm leaving the students love it.
I take it you're talking about Orwell and no James.
Oh no.
Willie, take one more.
One more question. I think there was one more question up that. Yeah, I see standing room only for George Square, 31st December 1936, I think. Then down to London. They time in London. They went to the movies in London, according to my father, and then down to would it be Southampton? Down to sail across to France, to Paris, where they went to the Communist Party headquarters that were there, and then across the Pyrenees, and then into
It was organised through London, wasn't
it? It was later on they had to cross the Pyrenees.
Yeah.
They were fortunate enough.
Yeah.
At that time you could buy a weekend pass without having a passport. There was very few, if any of them, had passports. And they got this weekend pass for going to Paris. They had no intentions of coming back. And from there was people in Paris helping them to get to Spain.